It was the dead of winter when I moved into my new suburban house, a cozy little place with a quaint charm. The snow lay thick on the ground, muffling the sounds of the outside world and lending an eerie stillness to the neighborhood. As I unpacked my belongings and settled into my new home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, had warned me about strange occurrences in the neighborhood, but I brushed off her warnings as the ramblings of an old woman. But then, one night as I sat alone in my living room, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I glanced out the window and saw a figure standing in the shadows, a man, tall and slender, watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared back at him, unable to tear my eyes away. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, unmoving, like a statue carved from the darkness itself. I wanted to call out to him, to demand to know who he was and what he wanted, but fear held me back, paralyzing me with its icy grip. I felt as though I was being watched, not just by the man outside, but by something else, something far more sinister. For days, the man continued to watch me, his presence a constant source of unease. I tried to go about my daily routine as if nothing was wrong, but his eyes followed me wherever I went, like a predator stalking its prey. I knew I had to confront him, to demand answers, but every time I tried to muster the courage, fear held me back. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped by the ever-watchful gaze of the man outside. And then, one night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard the sound of footsteps outside my window. I held my breath, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest as the footsteps grew closer, closer. And then, suddenly, they stopped. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the silence, my senses on high alert. And then, without warning, the window shattered, showering me with glass as a figure leaped through the opening and into my room. I screamed, scrambling out of bed and backing away as the intruder advanced, his eyes wild with madness. He was tall and thin, his face contorted into a mask of rage as he lunged for me, his hands outstretched like claws. I fought back, lashing out with whatever I could find, a lamp, a book, anything to keep him at bay. But he was relentless, his movements quick and precise as he cornered me against the wall. I thought I was going to die, that this was the end, but then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stopped, his eyes widening in surprise as he looked past me, out the window. I turned to see what he was looking at and saw Mrs. Thompson standing in the yard, a shotgun clutched in her trembling hands. She fired off a warning shot, sending the intruder fleeing into the night. I collapsed to the ground, shaking with fear and relief as Mrs. Thompson rushed to my side, her face pale with concern. She told me that she had seen the man outside my window and had come to investigate, just in time to save me from whatever he had planned. I thanked her profusely, tears streaming down my face as I realized just how close I had come to losing my life. Mrs. Thompson helped me clean up the broken glass and stayed with me until morning, her presence a comforting reminder that I was not alone. In the days that followed, the police launched a search for the intruder, but he was never found. I moved out of the neighborhood soon after, as I just did not feel safe anymore. Moving into our new suburban house with my wife was supposed to be the start of a happy chapter in our lives, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. At first, everything seemed normal. We unpacked our belongings, settled into our new home, and tried to make it our own. But then we noticed our neighbor, Mr. Johnson, always seemed to be watching us from his window. It started innocently enough, just a friendly wave or a passing hello whenever we saw him outside. But then things took a turn for the strange. We would catch glimpses of him peering at us through his curtains, his eyes following our every move as we went about our day. It made us uneasy, but we tried to brush it off as harmless curiosity. Maybe he was just lonely, we thought, or bored in his retirement. But then things started to escalate. We would hear strange noises coming from his house at odd hours of the night, footsteps on the stairs, doors creaking open and shut, muffled voices drifting through the walls. We tried to ignore it, to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. But deep down, we knew something was wrong. And then one night, things came to a head. We were sitting in our living room, watching TV, when we heard a knock at the door. I went to answer it, expecting to find a neighbor stopping by to say hello. But when I opened the door, there was no one there, just an empty doorstep and the sound of footsteps retreating down the driveway. I shook my head in confusion, wondering if it had just been a prank or a trick of the wind. But then I noticed something strange, a small package lying on the ground, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Curiosity getting the better of me, I picked it up and brought it inside, my heart pounding in my chest as I tore open the wrapping to reveal its contents. Inside was a photograph, a picture of me and my wife, taken through our living room window. But what chilled me to the bone was the message scrawled across the bottom in shaky handwriting, always watching. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized the full extent of Mr. Johnson's obsession. He wasn't just a curious neighbor, he was dangerous, unhinged, and fixated on us in a way that sent chills down my spine. We knew we had to do something, to confront him and put an end to his harassment once and for all. But we were scared, unsure of what he might do if we challenged him directly. So instead, we tried to keep our distance, to avoid him as much as possible and hope that he would eventually lose interest and leave us alone. But Mr. Johnson wasn't about to give up that easily. He continued to watch us, to stalk us from the shadows, his presence a constant source of fear and anxiety. And then, one night, things took a terrifying turn. We were awoken by the sound of breaking glass, followed by the shrill sound of our burglar alarm blaring through the house. Heart pounding, I jumped out of bed and raced downstairs, my wife close behind me, to confront the intruder. But when we reached the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves face to face with Mr. Johnson, his eyes wild with madness as he brandished a kitchen knife in his hand. We froze in terror, unable to move as he advanced towards us, his laughter echoing through the empty house. But then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, we heard the sound of approaching sirens outside, the police, responding to our alarm. Mr. Johnson's face paled, his eyes widening in fear, as he realized he had been caught. With a final, desperate cry, he turned and fled out the back door, disappearing into the night. Relief washed over us as we collapsed to the ground, shaken but alive. We knew we had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, thanks to the timely intervention of the authorities. But as we picked up the pieces of our shattered lives in the days that followed, we couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. We had escaped, but at what cost? And would Mr. Johnson ever return to finish what he had started? Only time would tell, but one thing was for certain, we would never forget the terror of those long, dark nights spent living in fear of our neighbor's obsessive gaze. It started innocently enough. I'm a contractor, and I'd bought this old fixer-upper with grand plans to renovate it into a beautiful home. The house was old, sure, but it had character, the kind you just can't find in newer builds. So, armed with my tools and enthusiasm, I dove headfirst into the renovations. At first, everything seemed normal. I tore down walls, ripped up old carpet, and pulled out outdated fixtures, all in the hopes of breathing new life into the old house. But as I worked, I started to notice strange things, little details that didn't quite add up. It started with the walls. As I tore away the drywall, I found strange markings etched into the plaster beneath. They were crude, almost like someone had carved them with their fingernails, and they seemed to form some kind of pattern, though I couldn't make heads or tails of it. I tried to shrug it off as nothing, just the remnants of some previous owner's eccentricity, perhaps. But as I continued to work, I found more and more strange things hidden within the house's structure. One day, as I was tearing out a section of flooring in the kitchen, my crowbar struck something solid beneath the floorboards. Curious, I pried up the boards and found myself staring down at a pile of bones, human bones. I recoiled in horror, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Had someone been murdered in this house? And if so, how had their remains ended up buried beneath the floorboards? I called the police, of course, and they launched an investigation into the house's history. As it turned out, the house had a dark past, a history of violence and tragedy that stretched back decades. Apparently, the previous owner had been a recluse, a man who had lived alone in the house for years, shunning contact with the outside world. And as the police dug deeper, they uncovered evidence of unspeakable horrors hidden within the walls of the old house. It seemed that the recluse had been a serial killer, a man who had lured unsuspecting victims to their deaths within the confines of the old house. And as the police excavated the property, they found more and more evidence of his crimes, hidden chambers beneath the floorboards, filled with the remains of his victims. I was sickened by what I saw, by the thought that I had been living and working in a house that had been the scene of such horrors. But as the police continued their investigation, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something lurking within the old house, something dark and sinister, waiting to be uncovered. In the end, the police never found any evidence of other bodies buried on the property, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something lurking within the walls of the old house, something that refused to be forgotten. I finished the renovations as quickly as I could, eager to put the horrors of the past behind me and move on with my life. But no matter where I went or what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that the old house was still watching me. I moved to a new town for a fresh start, and I found a room to rent in a boarding house owned by a reclusive landlord named Mr. Thompson. The place seemed quiet and peaceful at first, but soon I started noticing strange things about Mr. Thompson. He rarely left his room, and whenever he did, he moved with an odd, shuffling gait, like he was trying to hide something. His eyes were always darting around, never meeting mine for more than a fleeting moment. At first, I chalked it up to him being a bit eccentric, but as the days passed, I began to feel increasingly uneasy around him. There was something about him that just didn't sit right with me. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard strange noises coming from Mr. Thompson's room. It sounded like he was talking to someone, but his voice was low and muffled, making it impossible to make out what he was saying. I tried to ignore it and go to sleep, but the noises continued, growing louder and more frantic as the night wore on. I lay in bed, listening to the strange sounds emanating from Mr. Thompson's room, my heart pounding in my chest. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I crept out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway to Mr. Thompson's door. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to make out what he was saying. And then, suddenly, the noises stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing as I waited for something to happen. But nothing did. The house was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. With trembling hands, I reached out and turned the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest as I pushed the door open and stepped into Mr. Thompson's room. What I saw there made my blood run cold. The room was filled with strange objects and symbols, scattered haphazardly across the floor. In the center of the room stood Mr. Thompson, his eyes wide with madness as he stared at me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to back away, but before I could move, Mr. Thompson lunged at me, his hands reaching out to grab me. I screamed and stumbled backwards, tripping over one of the objects on the floor and falling to the ground. As I scrambled to my feet and ran for the door, I could hear Mr. Thompson's footsteps echoing behind me, growing louder and closer with each passing second. I burst through the door and ran down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced towards the front door. But just as I reached it, I felt a hand grab my shoulder and yank me backwards. I screamed and struggled, but Mr. Thompson was too strong, his grip like iron as he dragged me back into the house. I fought with every ounce of strength I had, but it was no use. Mr. Thompson was too powerful, his eyes burning with madness as he dragged me towards his room, his intentions clear. But just as I thought all hope was lost, I heard the sound of sirens outside, followed by the pounding of footsteps as the police burst through the front door. They wrestled Mr. Thompson to the ground and dragged him away in handcuffs, his screams echoing through the empty house as they took him away. I collapsed to the ground, shaking and exhausted, but relieved to be alive. The police questioned me about what had happened, and I told them everything I knew about Mr. Thompson and his dark secrets. In the end, Mr. Thompson was taken away to face justice for his crimes, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. Moving into our new apartment with my girlfriend was supposed to be an exciting new chapter in our lives, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. At first, everything seemed normal. We unpacked our belongings, settled into our new space, and tried to make it feel like home. But then strange things started happening. It started with little things, items going missing, doors slamming shut on their own, strange noises in the middle of the night. We tried to brush it off as just the quirks of an old building, but deep down, we knew something wasn't right. And then we started receiving threatening messages, notes slipped under our door, emails sent from anonymous addresses, even strange phone calls in the middle of the night. At first, we thought it was just a prank, maybe some bored teenager messing with us for kicks. But as the messages grew more frequent and more aggressive, we started to fear for our safety. We tried to ignore it, to convince ourselves that it was just a coincidence or a misunderstanding. But then things took a turn for the worse. One night, we were awoken by the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen. Heart pounding, I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and went to investigate, my girlfriend close behind me. But when we reached the kitchen, we found it empty, no sign of an intruder, no broken glass, nothing. We searched the entire apartment, but there was no one there. We were shaken, but we tried to convince ourselves that it had just been a false alarm, maybe a stray cat knocking something over outside. But then the messages started again, more frequent, more aggressive, more terrifying than ever before. They knew things about us, personal things, things that no one else could possibly know. We tried to figure out who could be behind it, who could possibly hate us enough to want to hurt us like this. But no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't come up with any answers. And then, one night, we saw them, a shadowy figure lurking in the hallway outside our apartment, watching us from the darkness. We tried to confront them, to chase them away, but they vanished before we could reach them, disappearing into thin air like they had never been there at all. We were terrified, but we knew we couldn't just sit back and do nothing. We had to find out who was behind these threats, who was terrorizing us in our own home. So we started digging, searching through old records and talking to neighbors, trying to piece together the puzzle of our apartment's dark history. And that's when we uncovered the truth. Our apartment used to belong to a vengeful ex-tenant, someone who had been evicted for harassing their neighbors and causing trouble. We realized then that we were dealing with more than just a prankster or a bored teenager. We were dealing with someone who had a vendetta against us, someone who would stop at nothing to drive us out of our home. But we refused to be intimidated. We stood our ground, determined to fight back against the darkness that threatened to consume us. And in the end, our perseverance paid off. With the help of the authorities, we were able to track down the ex-tenant and put an end to their reign of terror once and for all. It wasn't easy, and there were times when we feared for our lives, but in the end, we emerged victorious, stronger and more resilient than ever before. We learned that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight, lurking in the shadows of our everyday lives, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I hired a housekeeper to help maintain my new home, thinking it would make my life easier. But soon, things took a dark turn. At first, everything seemed fine. The housekeeper, Mrs. Phillips, was polite and efficient, and she seemed to do a good job of keeping the place clean. But then, strange things started happening. I would come home from work to find things moved around, items missing, or strange marks on the walls. At first, I brushed it off as just my imagination, or maybe Mrs. Phillips moving things around while she cleaned. But as the incidents became more frequent, I started to suspect that something was wrong. I confronted Mrs. Phillips about it, but she just brushed off my concerns, saying that I must have misplaced the items myself or forgotten that I had moved them. I tried to convince myself that she was right, that I was just being paranoid. But then I started noticing other odd behaviors. Mrs. Phillips would linger in the house long after her shift was over, and sometimes I would catch her whispering to herself in the hallway. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just harmless eccentricity. But then things took a darker turn. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering my name outside my bedroom door. Heart pounding, I crept out of bed and tiptoed towards the door, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was out there. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. I searched the entire house, but it was empty, no sign of Mrs. Phillips or anyone else. I tried to convince myself that it had just been a dream, or maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then I found something that made my blood run cold, a photograph of me, taken while I slept, tucked under my pillow. I knew then that something was seriously wrong, that Mrs. Phillips was not who she appeared to be. But I didn't know what to do. I was alone in the house with her, and I didn't know how to confront her without putting myself in danger. I tried to leave, to get out of the house and call the police, but every time I tried to open the front door, it was locked tight, as if someone was holding it shut from the other side. Panic rising, I ran to the back door, hoping to escape that way. But when I got there, I found it barricaded shut with heavy furniture, as if someone had been trying to keep me inside. I was trapped, alone in the house with Mrs. Phillips and whatever sinister agenda she had planned for me. I didn't know what to do, where to turn for help. But then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard a noise outside, the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway, getting closer and closer to the house. With a surge of adrenaline, I ran to the window and looked out, praying to see a neighbor or passerby who could help me. And to my relief, that's exactly what I saw, a group of people approaching the house, led by a police officer. I rushed to the door and threw it open, shouting for help as I ran towards them. Mrs. Phillips tried to stop me, but I pushed past her, desperate to get away from her and whatever twisted plans she had in store. The police quickly took control of the situation, apprehending Mrs. Phillips and searching the house for evidence of her crimes. And what they found was chilling: hidden cameras, listening devices, and evidence of Mrs. Phillips's obsession with me, dating back for months. I was shaken, but relieved to be safe at last. Mrs. Phillips was taken away in handcuffs, and I never saw her again. So, I recently moved into this furnished apartment. Seemed like a decent place, cozy, affordable, and in a good neighborhood. But there was something off about it from the start. I noticed it right away, this one locked room that the landlord insisted was off limits. Said it was just storage, nothing to worry about. But there was something about the way he said it that set off alarm bells in my head. I tried to put it out of my mind at first. Figured I was just being paranoid, you know? But the longer I lived there, the more that locked room gnawed at me. I had to know what was inside. So, one day when the landlord was out, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I grabbed a spare key he'd left lying around and unlocked the door to the mysterious room. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The room was filled with stolen artifacts, ancient relics, priceless treasures, you name it. It was like something out of a museum, only all crammed into this tiny little room. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Had my landlord been stealing from museums and stashing the loot in his apartment? And if so, what else was he capable of? I confronted the landlord about it, demanded answers. But he just laughed it off, said I was overreacting. Told me to mind my own business and stay out of that room if I knew what was good for me. But I couldn't let it go. I knew I had to do something to put a stop to whatever shady business my landlord was involved in. So, I contacted the authorities, told them everything I knew. But before they could do anything, my landlord found out what I'd done. And let me tell you, he was not happy about it. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock at the door. Figured it was just a neighbor or something, so I went to answer it. But when I opened the door, there was my landlord, standing there with a look of pure malice in his eyes. Before I could react, he lunged at me, pinning me against the wall with surprising strength. He whispered threats in my ear, told me to keep my mouth shut if I knew what was good for me. I tried to fight back, but he was too strong. He dragged me into the living room, where he proceeded to beat me within an inch of my life. I screamed for help, but no one came. It was just me and him, alone in that tiny apartment. Eventually, he grew tired of beating me and left me lying there on the floor, broken and bleeding. As I lay there, I realized just how lucky I was to still be alive. But I also knew that my ordeal was far from over. I had to get out of there, to escape before my landlord came back to finish the job. So, I dragged myself to my feet and stumbled out into the night, leaving behind everything I owned in that godforsaken apartment. I don't know what became of my landlord after that, whether he was ever caught or if he's still out there, preying on unsuspecting tenants. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the terror I felt that night. My husband and I moved into a cozy suburban house, eager to start a new chapter in our lives. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, with neatly trimmed lawns and friendly neighbors. But soon, we noticed something strange about the neighbor next door. Every time we looked out our window, we would catch glimpses of our neighbor watching us from behind their curtains. It was unnerving, to say the least, but we tried to brush it off as mere curiosity. However, as the days went by, strange occurrences began happening around our property. Our garden tools would go missing, only to reappear in odd places days later. Our outdoor lights would flicker on and off at random times, and we would hear strange noises coming from the direction of our neighbor's house late at night. At first, we tried to rationalize it away, blaming it on the wind or faulty wiring. But deep down, we couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, as we were sitting down to dinner, we heard a loud banging coming from the direction of our neighbor's house. It sounded like someone was hammering on the walls, their frantic blows echoing through the quiet night air. My husband went to investigate, but when he knocked on our neighbor's door, there was no answer. We could hear the banging getting louder and more frantic, as if whatever was causing it was trying to break free from inside the house. Suddenly, the banging stopped, and there was an eerie silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. We exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do next. The next morning, we noticed strange marks on the exterior of our house, like someone had been trying to scratch their way in. We also found footprints in the snow leading from our neighbor's house to ours, confirming our suspicions that they were somehow involved in the strange occurrences. We decided to confront our neighbor about what had been happening, but when we knocked on their door, there was no answer. We could hear movement inside the house, but no one came to the door. Feeling uneasy, we decided to call the police and report the strange occurrences. When they arrived, we told them everything we knew, but they seemed skeptical, chalking it up to paranoia or stress. But as the days went by, the strange occurrences only intensified. We would wake up in the middle of the night to find our neighbor standing outside our window, watching us with a sinister grin on their face. We tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched was always there, lurking in the back of our minds like a shadowy presence. Then, one night, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard a loud crash coming from our backyard. We rushed outside to investigate, only to find our neighbor standing in the middle of our garden, holding a shovel and digging furiously in the frozen ground. We tried to approach them, but they ignored us, their eyes glazed over with madness as they continued to dig. We could see something buried in the ground, something dark and twisted, but we couldn't make out what it was. Feeling a sense of dread creeping over us, we called the police once again and reported what we had seen. This time, they took us seriously, and they arrived at our house within minutes, their sirens wailing in the night air. They arrested our neighbor on the spot, and as they led them away in handcuffs. I moved into a new apartment in the bustling city, excited to start this new chapter of my life. Everything seemed normal at first, but then things started to get strange. It started small, food missing from my pantry, personal items moved from where I had left them. At first, I thought I was just forgetful, or maybe I had misplaced things without realizing it. But as the days went by, the incidents became more frequent and more unsettling. I would come home from work to find my belongings scattered around the apartment, as if someone had been searching through them while I was away. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But then I found something that made my blood run cold, a set of footprints in the dust on my windowsill, leading from the balcony to the living room. I knew then that someone had been entering my apartment while I was out, someone who didn't belong there. Panic rising, I called the police, but they couldn't find any evidence of forced entry, and there was nothing they could do without more concrete proof. Feeling helpless, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed security cameras around the apartment, hoping to catch whoever was responsible in the act. But even with the cameras in place, the incidents continued. Every time I reviewed the footage, there was nothing, no sign of anyone entering or leaving the apartment. No explanation for the strange occurrences. I started to question my own sanity, wondering if I was imagining things or if there was some rational explanation for what was happening. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone was watching me, someone who meant me harm. As the days turned into weeks, the situation escalated. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door, or the feeling of someone watching me from the shadows. I tried to confront whoever was responsible, to catch them in the act and put an end to their games. But every time I thought I had them cornered, they would slip away, leaving me feeling more frustrated and powerless than ever. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything other than the constant feeling of dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear and paranoia. But then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I had a breakthrough. One night, as I was reviewing the security footage, I caught a glimpse of something, a shadowy figure lurking in the hallway outside my apartment. Heart pounding, I rewound the footage and watched it again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And that's when I saw it. The figure was wearing a hoodie, its face obscured by the darkness. With a surge of adrenaline, I called the police and showed them the footage. This time, they took me seriously, launching a full investigation into the matter. And finally, after weeks of terror and uncertainty, they caught the person responsible, a former tenant of the building who had been evicted months earlier. He had been living in the building's crawl space, sneaking into apartments at night to steal food and belongings. I was relieved, but also shaken to the core. The thought of someone watching me, lurking in the shadows just a few feet away, was enough to make my skin crawl. I moved out of the apartment soon after. So, I moved into this house a few months back. Seemed like a decent place, spacious, good location, and the rent was reasonable. But there was something off about the landlord right from the start. He was always showing up unannounced, claiming he needed to do repairs or check on things. But it started to feel like he was just using it as an excuse to snoop around and pry into my personal life. At first, I tried to brush it off. Figured he was just a nosy guy, you know? But the more he kept showing up, the more I started to feel uneasy about the whole situation. Then one day, I caught him snooping around in the basement. Said he was checking for water damage or something, but I knew he was up to something else. I decided to do a little digging of my own, started asking around about the house and the landlord. Turns out, he had a reputation for being a bit of a creep, always meddling in his tenants' business and never giving them any privacy. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon some old newspaper clippings in the attic that I realized just how twisted things really were. The clippings detailed a series of disappearances that had occurred in the area years ago. People would just vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and grieving families. And you know what's the creepiest part? The dates of the disappearances lined up perfectly with the time that the landlord had owned the house. I knew I had to confront him about it, but I also knew I had to be careful. I didn't want to tip him off before I had all the evidence I needed to bring him down. So, I started keeping a close eye on him, watching his every move, listening in on his conversations. And what I discovered chilled me to the bone. He wasn't just a landlord with a penchant for prying into his tenants' lives. He was a predator, a sick, twisted monster who used his position of power to lure unsuspecting victims into his clutches. I knew I had to put a stop to it, to expose him for the monster he really was. But I also knew it wouldn't be easy. He was smart, cunning, and dangerous, and he'd stop at nothing to protect his dark secrets. But I wasn't about to back down. I owed it to those poor souls who had vanished without a trace, to make sure their voices were heard and their stories were told. So, I gathered up all the evidence I collected and went to the authorities. I told them everything I knew about the disappearances, about the landlord's shady behavior, about the newspaper clippings I'd found in the attic. And you know what? They listened. They launched an investigation into the landlord and his connections to the disappearances, and before long, they had enough evidence to put him away for a long time. As for me, I moved out of the house as soon as I could. I didn't want to stick around and risk becoming the landlord's next victim. I moved into a cramped apartment in a rundown building, hoping for a fresh start in the city. The neighborhood was rough, with graffiti-covered walls and trash littering the streets, but I was determined to make the best of it. From the moment I moved in, I noticed a homeless person hanging around near my doorstep. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, it wasn't uncommon to see homeless people in the area. But as days passed, their presence became more and more unsettling. They would lurk in the shadows, watching me with hollow eyes as I entered and exited the building. Sometimes, I would catch them muttering to themselves, their words slurred and unintelligible. I tried to ignore them, but their behavior grew increasingly aggressive. They would shout at me as I passed by, accusing me of stealing their apartment and threatening to harm me if I didn't leave. At first, I brushed it off as the ramblings of a disturbed individual, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in the pit of my stomach whenever I saw them. Things came to a head one night when I returned home late from work. As I approached the building, I could sense their presence lurking in the darkness, their eyes burning into me like hot coals. I quickened my pace, eager to escape their gaze, but they stepped out from the shadows, blocking my path. Their face was contorted with rage, and I could see the glint of madness in their eyes. They lunged at me, their hands reaching out to grab me, but I managed to duck out of the way just in time. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest. I screamed for help, but the streets were deserted, and no one came to my aid. I realized I was on my own, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. Desperate, I managed to break free from their grasp and sprinted towards the safety of my apartment. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, panting heavily as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. I could hear them banging on the door, their fists pounding against the wood with a deafening intensity. I frantically searched for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation, pleading for help as tears streamed down my face. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive, the sound of the homeless person's pounding growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, and relief washed over me like a tidal wave. The police burst through the door moments later, their guns drawn as they apprehended the homeless person and led them away in handcuffs. As they disappeared into the night, I sank to the ground, overcome with exhaustion and relief. It was over, but the memory of that terrifying encounter would haunt me for the rest of my days. I moved into a furnished apartment recently. It was a decent place, nothing fancy, but it felt cozy enough for me. However, things started to get weird when I started receiving mysterious letters in the mail. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured they were just addressed to the previous tenant and got mixed up in the mail somehow. But as the letters kept coming, I started to get suspicious. They were all addressed to someone named Sarah, the previous tenant, but they weren't your typical junk mail or bills. Instead, they were handwritten and seemed to be getting increasingly threatening with each one. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that it was just a prank or a misunderstanding. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I decided to do some digging, to see if I could find out more about Sarah and why she might be receiving these letters. I asked the landlord about her, but he claimed he didn't know anything and that she had moved out suddenly without leaving a forwarding address. Feeling frustrated and scared, I started to wonder if maybe Sarah still had a key to the apartment and was coming back to torment me. I tried to change the locks, but the landlord refused, saying it wasn't necessary. As the letters continued to arrive, I started to feel like I was being watched, like someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything other than the constant feeling of dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. I considered calling the police, but I was afraid they wouldn't take me seriously, or worse, that they would think I was crazy. So instead, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up security cameras around the apartment, hoping to catch whoever was responsible in the act. But every time I reviewed the footage, there was nothing, no sign of anyone entering or leaving the apartment, no explanation for the strange occurrences. I started to question my own sanity, wondering if I was imagining things or if there was some rational explanation for what was happening. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone was watching me, someone who meant me harm. Desperate for answers, I reached out to Sarah's old neighbors, hoping they might have some insight into her past. But they all claimed not to know her or anything about her. Feeling more alone and terrified than ever, I resolved to confront whoever was behind this once and for all. I stayed up night after night, waiting for them to make their move, but they never did. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I received a final letter, one that sent chills down my spine. It was a picture of me, taken from outside my window, with a message scrawled across the back, "I'm always watching." That was the last straw. I packed up my things and left the apartment that night, never looking back. I never found out who was behind the letters or why they were targeting me, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget it. So, I moved into this new house with my family a few weeks ago. Seemed like a nice, cozy place at first, perfect for us to start fresh and settle down. But then, weird things started happening. At first, it was just little stuff, things going missing, doors creaking open on their own. I figured it was just the house settling in, you know? Nothing to worry about. But then, we started hearing noises at night, strange, unsettling noises that seemed to come from nowhere. Footsteps echoing down the hallway, whispers drifting through the walls. It was like someone, or something, was lurking in the shadows, watching our every move. At first, we tried to ignore it. Told ourselves it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. But the noises only got louder, more persistent, until we couldn't ignore them anymore. We started to suspect that maybe someone, or something, was living in the walls or the attic. It was the only explanation that made sense. But when we searched the house from top to bottom, we couldn't find any sign of an intruder. That's when things really started to get creepy. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching coming from the attic. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning, but it quickly grew louder and more frantic. I tried to wake up my husband, but he just grumbled and rolled over, too tired to deal with my paranoia. So, I went up to the attic myself, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of dread. As I climbed the creaky old stairs, the scratching grew louder and more insistent, echoing off the walls and sending shivers down my spine. When I finally reached the attic, I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I would find on the other side of the door. But I knew I had to confront whatever, or whoever, was making those noises. I swung open the door and shone my flashlight into the darkness, half expecting to come face to face with some kind of monster or intruder. But what I saw was even more terrifying. The attic was empty, completely, eerily empty. There was no sign of anyone or anything, no trace of the scratching or the whispers that had driven me up here in the first place. I searched every nook and cranny, convinced that I must have missed something. But there was nothing, just an empty attic with no explanation for the noises that had brought me here. I was about to give up and head back downstairs when I heard it, a soft, chilling whisper, coming from somewhere deep within the shadows. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to make out the words. It was faint, almost indistinct, but there was no mistaking the sinister tone. "Get out," it whispered, sending a shiver down my spine. Get out before it's too late. I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed the attic door shut and practically ran back downstairs, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I tried to tell my husband what had happened, but he just brushed it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew that something was seriously wrong with this house. We tried to go about our lives as normal, but the whispers and the footsteps never stopped. They followed us everywhere we went, haunting our every waking moment and driving us to the brink of madness. Finally, we couldn't take it anymore. We packed up our things and moved out, leaving the house and its secrets behind us for good. But even now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, is watching me, lurking in the shadows and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I don't know what was living in that house, or why it chose to torment us. I rented a cabin in the woods for 6 months. It seemed like the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life, just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature. But on my second week there, things took a turn for the worse. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of creaking floorboards. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal outside, but then I saw him, a stranger standing in my bedroom, bathed in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, trying to make sense of what was happening. The man looked at me with a haunted expression, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. He claimed to have lived in the cabin before me, said he used to call it home. But as he spoke, his words grew more frantic, more disjointed, until it was clear that something wasn't right. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to believe him, to offer him some kind of help or comfort. But another part of me was terrified of this stranger in my home, terrified of what he might do next. I tried to reason with him, to get him to leave peacefully, but he refused. He kept repeating the same things over and over, like he was trapped in some kind of loop, unable to break free. Eventually, I managed to convince him to leave, promising to help him find somewhere else to go. But as soon as he was out the door, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, relief that I was finally alone again, that I could put this strange encounter behind me. But the next morning, when I went to check on the cabin's owner, I discovered the truth. The previous tenant had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving no trace behind. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized the gravity of the situation. I had been living in a place with a dark history, a place where someone had vanished without a trace, and I had been completely unaware. I tried to put it out of my mind, to focus on the present and not dwell on the past. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. Days turned into weeks, and still, the memory of that night haunted me. I started to hear strange noises in the middle of the night, footsteps in the hallway, whispers in the dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was always just out of reach. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was letting fear get the best of me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone was still out there, someone who didn't want me in their home. I started to question my decision to rent the cabin in the first place, to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. But no matter how much I wanted to leave, I couldn't. I was trapped, both by my own fear and by the isolation of the woods. Then, one night, as I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the forest outside, I heard it, a knock on the door, soft and hesitant, like someone unsure if they should be there. My heart skipped a beat as I crept out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see the stranger from before, but instead, I saw nothing, just the darkness of the night stretching out before me. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend like I hadn't heard anything. But another part of me was curious, desperate for answers to the questions that had been plaguing me for weeks. In the end, curiosity won out. I opened the door slowly, cautiously, half expecting to see the stranger waiting for me on the other side. But to my surprise, there was no one there, just an empty hallway, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. I stepped outside, my heart racing in my chest, and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. It was as if whoever had knocked had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but silence and uncertainty. I returned to bed, my mind racing with possibilities. Had it all been a trick of the mind, a figment of my imagination? Or was there really someone out there, someone who didn't want me in their home? I tried to push the thoughts away, to convince myself that I was safe and that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew the truth. The woods were full of secrets, and I was just beginning to scratch the surface. So, I moved into this new apartment building a few weeks ago. It's nothing fancy, just a small place in a quiet neighborhood. But the rent was cheap, and it seemed like a nice enough place to live. My neighbor, let's call her Sarah, seemed friendly enough at first. We'd chat in the hallway, exchange pleasantries, that sort of thing. But pretty soon, her friendliness started to feel a little off. She'd always be hanging around outside my door, offering to help with groceries or inviting me over for coffee. At first, I thought she was just being neighborly, but then I started to notice little things that didn't sit right with me. Like, she'd always know exactly when I was leaving or coming home, even if I hadn't told her my schedule. And whenever I mentioned something in passing, like, say, that I was going out of town for the weekend, she'd remember it weeks later and ask me about it. It was like she was keeping tabs on me, watching my every move. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just lonely, or maybe I was being paranoid. But then things started to get really weird. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard footsteps outside my door. At first, I thought it was just Sarah coming home late, but then I realized that the footsteps were too light, too deliberate. I lay there, frozen in fear, as the footsteps grew closer and closer, until they were right outside my door. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I wanted to go out and confront whoever was out there, but I was too scared. What if it was someone dangerous? So, I just lay there in bed, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, until eventually, exhaustion overtook me and I fell asleep. The next morning, I went out into the hallway to see if I could find any clues about who had been lurking outside my door. But there was nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. I tried to put the incident out of my mind, but it kept nagging at me. Who could have been outside my door, and why? And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, they did. One day, I came home from work to find a note taped to my door. It was from Sarah, inviting me over for dinner that night. At first, I thought it was just a friendly gesture, but then I noticed something strange about the handwriting. It was different from Sarah's usual scrawl, neater, more precise. That's when it hit me. The handwriting on the note matched the handwriting on the envelope of a letter I had received a few days earlier. A letter that had been sent to me anonymously, with no return address or signature. I didn't know what to do. Should I go over to Sarah's for dinner and confront her about the note? Or should I ignore it and hope that whatever was going on would just go away on its own? In the end, I decided to go over to Sarah's apartment and see if I could get some answers. But when I knocked on her door, there was no answer. I tried calling out her name, but still, nothing. Feeling a sense of unease creeping over me, I decided to try the door handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find Sarah lying dead on the floor or something equally horrifying. But instead, I found myself face to face with an empty apartment, no furniture, no belongings, nothing. It was like Sarah had never even lived there in the first place. I searched every inch of the apartment, looking for any clues about where she might have gone or what might have happened to her. But there was nothing, no notes, no letters, nothing to indicate where she might have gone or why she had disappeared so suddenly. Feeling more confused and scared than ever, I decided to leave the apartment and go back to my own. But as I turned to go, something caught my eye, a small camera, hidden in the corner of the room, pointed directly at my front door. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what it meant. Sarah had been watching me, spying on me, this whole time. And now, she was gone, leaving behind nothing but questions and a sense of unease that I knew would haunt me for a long time to come. I recently moved into a new house, excited to start fresh in a new neighborhood. Everything seemed fine at first, but then things took a turn for the worse. One day, when I returned home from work, I noticed something strange. The front door was slightly ajar, and there were signs of forced entry around the lock. My heart raced as I realized someone had been in my house while I was away. I cautiously entered, my senses on high alert as I searched the house for any signs of intruders. But everything seemed to be in its place, and nothing appeared to be stolen or out of order. Despite the lack of evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I felt an eerie sense of unease settle over me. Determined to find answers, I decided to install security cameras around the perimeter of the house. Maybe then I could catch whoever was responsible for breaking in. But no matter how many hours of footage I reviewed, I couldn't find any evidence of anyone entering or leaving the house. It was as if whoever had broken in had simply vanished into thin air. The sense of paranoia only grew worse with each passing day. I would find myself constantly checking over my shoulder, convinced that someone was lurking in the shadows, watching my every move. Sleep became elusive as my mind raced with thoughts of potential intruders and worst-case scenarios. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind outside sent shivers down my spine. I started to doubt my own sanity, questioning whether I was imagining things or if there really was someone out there, waiting to strike when I least expected it. One night, as I lay in bed, wide awake and on edge, I heard a noise coming from downstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I tiptoed down the stairs, my breath catching in my throat with each step. I crept into the living room, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. And then I saw it, a shadowy figure lurking in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. My blood ran cold as I realized I wasn't alone. I could feel their eyes boring into me, their presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone, ready to call the police and put an end to this nightmare once and for all. But before I could dial, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but an empty room and a lingering sense of dread. I spent the rest of the night huddled in fear, the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears as I waited for morning to come. When the sun finally rose, I wasted no time in contacting the police and reporting what had happened. They searched the house from top to bottom but found no sign of any intruders. In the end, there was no explanation for what had happened. The break-in, the feeling of being watched, it all remained a mystery, haunting me long after the ordeal was over. I may never know the truth of what happened in that house. I moved into a shared house recently, looking forward to starting a new chapter in my life. But things took a turn for the worse when I started to notice some strange behavior from my roommate. At first, it was little things, missing items, things moved around in my room when I knew I hadn't touched them. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe I was just forgetful or that I had misplaced things myself. But as time went on, the incidents became more frequent and more disturbing. I would catch my roommate going through my belongings when they thought I wasn't looking, their eyes darting around nervously as if they were searching for something. I tried to confront them about it, to ask them why they were going through my stuff, but they always brushed it off, saying they were just looking for something or that they thought they had seen something of theirs in my room. But I knew better. I could see the guilt written all over their face, the way they avoided my gaze whenever I brought it up. It was like they were hiding something they didn't want me to know about. I started to feel paranoid, like I was being watched all the time. I would hear noises in the middle of the night, footsteps in the hallway, whispers outside my door, but whenever I went to investigate, there was never anyone there. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that I was just overreacting, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. My roommate's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, and I didn't know how much longer I could stay in that house without losing my mind. I considered moving out, finding a new place to live where I didn't have to constantly worry about someone going through my things. But I couldn't afford to break my lease, and I didn't have anywhere else to go. So instead, I tried to keep my distance from my roommate, to avoid them as much as possible and stay out of their way. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were always watching me, always waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I lay in bed, frozen with fear, as the footsteps grew closer and closer, until they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The house was silent once again, as if nothing had ever happened. But the next morning, when I went to leave my room, I found something waiting for me outside my door, a note written in my roommate's handwriting, telling me to leave before it was too late. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words, realizing that my suspicions had been right all along. My roommate did have a hidden agenda, and whatever it was dangerous. I knew I had to get out of there, to leave that house and never look back. But as I packed my bags and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that my roommate was still out there, waiting for me to make a move. I made it out of the house safely, but the experience left me shaken to my core. I still don't know what my roommate was up to or what they wanted from me. I recently bought a house from a couple who were going through a messy divorce. It seemed like a great deal at the time, a beautiful home at a price I could afford. But little did I know, I was about to step into a nightmare. It all started a few weeks after I moved in, when I started receiving threatening letters in the mail. They were from the ex-husband, warning me to leave the house or face consequences for interfering in their lives. At first, I tried to ignore them, thinking they were just empty threats from a bitter ex. But as the letters kept coming, I started to feel a growing sense of unease. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that it was just a prank or a misunderstanding. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Then, one night, I heard noises coming from outside my house. I went to investigate, but when I looked out the window, there was no one there. It was as if the sound had just disappeared into thin air. I tried to go back to bed, to put the strange noises out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I found scratches on my front door, like someone had tried to break in during the night. I called the police, but when they arrived, there was no sign of anyone around. I felt like I was going crazy, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I tried to go about my daily life as if nothing had happened, but the fear lingered in the back of my mind, like a shadow that refused to go away. Then, one day, I came home to find a note taped to my front door. It was from the ex-husband, warning me to leave the house or face the consequences. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words, realizing that I was in serious danger. I knew I had to get out of there, to leave the house and never look back. I packed my bags and left. I moved into this old apartment building a few months back, excited to start fresh in a new city. The place had character, sure, but it was cheap, and I figured I could deal with a few quirks for the price. Things started off fine, but after a couple of weeks, I noticed some strange things happening. Stuff would go missing and then turn up in weird places, like my keys ending up in the kitchen when I swore I left them in the living room. One day, I came home from work and found signs of forced entry. The lock on the basement door was busted, and it looked like someone had kicked it in. I searched the apartment, but nothing seemed to be missing, which just made it even creepier. I called the landlord to let him know what happened, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably just a break-in gone wrong. But something didn't sit right with me. It felt like someone had been watching me, lurking in the shadows just out of sight. I decided to install some security cameras around the apartment, hoping to catch whoever was responsible in the act. But no matter how many times I reviewed the footage, there was never anyone there. I started to feel paranoid, jumping at every little noise and constantly checking over my shoulder. It felt like I was being watched all the time, even in the safety of my own home. Then, one night, I heard a noise coming from the basement. It sounded like footsteps echoing through the empty halls, slow and deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and mustered up the courage to investigate, my heart pounding in my chest with every step I took. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread washed over me like a tidal wave. When I reached the bottom, I saw them, a figure huddled in the corner, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. I called out to them, demanding to know who they were and what they were doing there. But instead of answering, they became aggressive, lunging towards me with wild eyes and bared teeth. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing as I fumbled for my phone, ready to call the police. But before I could dial, they backed off, muttering something about having a right to be there as a squatter. It sent shivers down my spine, knowing that this person had been living in the basement of my building without permission. I tried to reason with them, pleading for them to leave, but they refused, their words slurred and unintelligible. It was clear that they weren't in their right mind, and I knew I had to get out of there before things escalated further. I retreated back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me and barricading it with whatever I could find. But even as I sat in my apartment, safe from harm, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. I didn't sleep a wink that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened if I hadn't stumbled upon them in the basement. It was a close call, and it made me realize just how vulnerable I really was in this old apartment building. The next day, I went to the landlord and demanded that he do something about the squatter in the basement. He seemed hesitant at first, but when I threatened to call the police, he finally agreed to take action. A few days later, I came home to find the basement door padlocked shut, a sign warning trespassers to stay out. It was a small victory, but it gave me some peace of mind knowing that the squatter was no longer lurking in the shadows. But even as I settled back into my routine, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like a dark cloud hanging over me, a constant reminder of the terror I had endured in that old apartment building. I moved out not long after, eager to leave the memories of that place behind me. But no matter where I go, I know that the fear will always follow, a haunting reminder of the night I came face to face with the unknown in the basement of my own home. So, I moved into this apartment a few months ago. The rent was cheap, and the location seemed perfect, close to work, close to public transportation, the whole deal. But pretty soon after I moved in, things started to get weird. First off, the landlord, let's call him Mr. Smith, seemed way too eager to rent the place out. Like, I'd barely finished looking around before he was practically shoving the lease agreement in my face, begging me to sign it. I didn't think too much of it at first. I mean, landlords can be a little pushy sometimes, right? But then, things started to get really creepy. Like, I'd come home from work and find Mr. Smith waiting for me outside my door, asking if I needed anything or if there were any problems with the apartment. At first, I thought he was just being a good landlord, trying to make sure everything was okay. But then, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right with me. Like, how did he always seem to know when I was coming and going, even when I didn't tell him my schedule? And then, one day, I found a hidden camera in my living room, just a tiny little thing, tucked away in the corner, pointed directly at my couch. I was horrified. I mean, who knows how long it had been there, or what Mr. Smith had been using it for. I tried to confront him about it, but he just brushed it off like it was no big deal. He said it was for security purposes, but I knew better. He'd been spying on me, watching my every move, probably listening in on my conversations too. I felt violated, like my privacy had been completely invaded. But what could I do? I couldn't afford to move out, and I didn't have any proof that Mr. Smith had been spying on me. So, I tried to ignore it and go about my life as usual. But then, things started to get even weirder. Like, I'd come home and find things moved around in my apartment, little things, like a picture frame knocked over or a book out of place. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful, but then I started to suspect that someone else had been in my apartment when I wasn't there. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And then, one night, I woke up to find Mr. Smith standing over my bed, watching me sleep. I screamed, and he ran out of the room, but I knew then that I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I packed up my things and left first thing in the morning, never looking back. I reported Mr. Smith to the authorities, but they said there wasn't much they could do without evidence. But I know what I saw. I know he was spying on me, manipulating me, using my personal information against me. It's been a few weeks since I moved out, and I'm still haunted by what happened. I can't shake the feeling that someone is always watching me, always lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. But I won't let fear control me. I won't let Mr. Smith win. I'll find a new place to live, somewhere safe, somewhere where I can finally feel at peace again. And maybe, just maybe, I'll be able to put this nightmare behind me once and for all. I decided to host a housewarming party after moving into my new place. Everything was going great, and I was having a blast showing off my new home to my friends and family. But as the night went on, things took a dark turn. I was tidying up the living room when I heard a noise coming from my bedroom. It sounded like someone rummaging through my closet. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just one of my friends looking for a place to stash their coat. But when I went to investigate, I found someone I didn't recognize hiding in the shadows of my closet. They claimed to be a friend of the previous owner, insisting that they had a right to be there. I was taken aback, not sure what to make of this unexpected guest. I tried to reason with them, explaining that I was the new owner and that they needed to leave. But they refused, their voice growing more agitated with each passing moment. It sent a chill down my spine, knowing that there was a stranger hiding in my closet, refusing to leave my home. I could feel my heart racing as I weighed my options. I didn't want things to escalate, but I knew I couldn't let this person stay in my house uninvited. I tried to stay calm as I called the police, hoping they would be able to resolve the situation peacefully. But as I waited for the police to arrive, the tension in the air grew thicker. The uninvited guests grew increasingly hostile, their words dripping with venom as they accused me of trying to steal their home. It was clear that they were not in their right mind, and I knew I had to tread carefully to avoid making things worse. When the police finally arrived, they managed to defuse the situation and escort the intruder out of my house. It was a relief to see them go, but the encounter left me shaken. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air, knowing that someone had been hiding in my closet, watching me from the shadows. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened if things had gone differently. It was a wake-up call, a reminder of the dangers that lurked just beyond the safety of my own home. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of paranoia that hung over me like a dark cloud. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent shivers down my spine, reminding me of the intruder who had invaded my home. But as time passed, the fear began to fade, replaced by a sense of determination. I refused to let this experience hold me back, determined to reclaim my sense of security and move on with my life. I installed new locks on all the doors and windows, taking extra precautions to ensure that no one could ever sneak into my home again. And as I settled back into my routine, I felt a newfound sense of confidence, knowing that I was taking control of my own safety. It was a harrowing experience, one that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But in the end, it taught me a valuable lesson about the importance of vigilance and resilience in the face of danger. And as I looked towards the future, I knew that I was stronger for having endured it. So, I moved into this new house a couple of weeks ago. It's a nice place, nothing too fancy, but it's got everything I need. The first few days were pretty normal, just unpacking boxes and getting settled in. But then, things started to get weird. I would come home from work and notice that things were out of place, little things at first, like my keys not being where I left them or my books stacked in a different order. At first, I thought maybe I was just being forgetful or that I was imagining things. But as it kept happening, I started to get this sinking feeling in my stomach, like something wasn't right. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But then, one day, I came home to find my laptop missing from my desk. I tore the place apart looking for it, but it was nowhere to be found. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I mean, who breaks into a house just to steal a laptop? It didn't make any sense. I decided to set up some cameras around the house, just to see if I could catch whoever was doing this. I figured if I had proof, I could go to the police and maybe they could do something about it. But when I checked the footage, there was nothing. No sign of anyone entering the house, no evidence of any intruders at all. It was like they just appeared out of thin air. I couldn't believe it. I mean, how is that even possible? It was like I was living in some kind of horror movie, where the bad guy can just vanish into thin air whenever they want. I tried to tell myself that there must be some rational explanation for all of this. Maybe I was sleepwalking and moving things without realizing it, or maybe there was some kind of glitch in the camera system. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew that there was something sinister going on, something that I couldn't explain away with logic or reason. The feeling of unease only grew stronger as the days went by. I started to feel like I was being watched, like someone was always lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to reach out to my neighbors, to see if they had noticed anything strange happening in the area. But they all just shrugged it off, telling me that I was probably just imagining things. I felt so alone, so isolated in my fear. It was like no one believed me, like I was just making it all up for attention or something. But I knew the truth. I knew that there was someone out there, someone who was targeting me for some reason that I couldn't understand. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow, just in case they decided to come back. Every little noise made me jump, every shadow made my heart race with fear. I felt like I was living in a constant state of terror, like I was always on edge, waiting for the next shoe to drop. But then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. I woke up one night to find someone standing over my bed, watching me sleep. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, grabbing the knife from under my pillow and brandishing it at them. But when I flicked on the light, there was no one there. I searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of anyone. It was like they had just vanished into thin air, leaving me alone in the darkness. I knew then that I had to get out of there, that I couldn't stay in that house a moment longer. I packed up my things and left, never looking back. I don't know who or what was behind all of those strange occurrences, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'm safe now, that I'm out of that house and away from whatever was haunting me. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, watching and waiting for their next victim. And that's a thought that sends shivers down my spine. I recently moved into this new apartment building, and I gotta say, things have been pretty rough ever since. It all started with my neighbor, this guy named Jerry. From the moment I met him, he seemed off, like he had a chip on his shoulder or something. At first, it was just little things, like him complaining about noise or accusing me of stealing his mail. But then, it started to escalate. He'd leave passive-aggressive notes on my door, accusing me of all sorts of things, like leaving trash in the hallway or making too much noise at night. I tried to ignore him at first, but it quickly became clear that Jerry wasn't going to let up. He'd bang on my walls at all hours of the night, blast music from his apartment, and even vandalize my door with spray paint. I tried talking to the landlord about it, but he didn't seem to take me seriously. He just brushed it off like it was no big deal, telling me to try to get along with Jerry and keep the peace. But how was I supposed to keep the peace with someone who seemed hell-bent on making my life a living hell? I tried to avoid Jerry as much as possible, but it seemed like he was always lurking around every corner, waiting to cause trouble. Things came to a head one night when I came home to find my apartment ransacked, furniture overturned, belongings scattered everywhere, the works. I was furious. I knew it had to be Jerry, but I had no proof. I called the police, but without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd keep an eye on things, but I didn't hold out much hope. From that point on, I lived in constant fear. Fear of what Jerry might do next. Fear of what might happen if I crossed him. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't concentrate on anything other than the constant threat hanging over my head. But then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. One night, I woke up to find Jerry standing over my bed, a crazed look in his eyes and a knife in his hand. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, bolting for the door as fast as I could. Jerry lunged at me, but I managed to slam the door shut just in time, blocking him out. I called the police again, and this time, they took me seriously. They arrested Jerry on the spot and charged him with assault and breaking and entering. I moved out of that apartment as soon as I could, never looking back. But even now, I can't shake the feeling of dread that still lingers, the feeling that Jerry might come back for me, that he might find a way to finish what he started. But for now, at least, I'm safe, safe from Jerry, safe from his threats, safe from the terror that consumed me for so long. And for that, I'm grateful.